To join the panel 2. We're going to continue our discussion of the report by CCG, the 3 scenarios and the policy proposals in the report about trying to resolve the U.S. China trade dispute. Our first speaker today is a longtime fellow here at Hudson Institute, Ambassador Husain Haqqani. He was formerly the ambassador of Pakistan to the United States. He's written 2 best-selling books with very provocative titles. One could apply to U.S. China relations, he has said in the past himself. It's called Magnificent Delusions. I wish we had a copy to hold up, to increase, and it has a new book as well. So Ambassador Haqqani, could you please offer us your views?
Thank you very much, Mike, and it's such a pleasure joining all of you. Thank you all for traveling and making the presentation this morning. Let me just begin by saying that the presentation this morning had 3 elements, points on which we can actually find some convergence with the presentation, points on which we are very clear at Hudson that we disagree, and those are for future conversation. And then there are definitely points which are points of contention, where the narrative presented does not actually match our perspective on those issues. So the presentation does provide a basis for us to have future conversation, but let me be frank, because when I served as ambassador, I decided that I'm going to invent a new school of diplomacy, which is the candor school of diplomacy. So tell the truth up front rather than beat about the bush, and that really helps move the discussion forward a lot more. There are many people in the United States and all over the world who admire China's accomplishments of the last few decades. No country in the world has had the kind of transformation within one generation in the economic realm that China has had. And that is all something that people here acknowledge and appreciate. Nobody says that China's progress is unreal. Nobody says that China has not contributed to global economic growth. There are issues that have become the basis for this trade confrontation. And those issues essentially are not related to what China has been able to accomplish for itself. They are related to 3 important categories, in my opinion, of criticisms of China's policies. The first is that China is not transparent. The most important aspect of that, of course, is that there are 2 different political systems. Now, in the United States, we have a very open political system. And in this open political system, it was actually acknowledged in the presentation in a very circuitous way, because the presentation said 60 American trade organizations have said this, so many congressmen have said that. Well, let's be very frank. If Mike Pillsbury and Arthur Herman and Husain Haqqani were to show up in Beijing and say, okay, now we're going to find all those 20, 30, 40 or 50 trade organizations who disagree with one aspect or another of President Xi's policies, we would not be able to get them together. We will not be able to lobby the National People's Congress to members of the National People's Congress to issue a public statement saying we disagree with this, and this aspect of the president's policy. You can do that in the United States. Now that creates a major difference between the 2 systems. American debates are transparent, American policies are transparent, and the process of policy making is quite transparent. And that transparency then leads to what I call the second point, which is China does not play fair. That is a presumption or an assumption or a fear at this end. Now, there are people in this country. Tom Friedman's latest column in the New York Times praises China, says America should actually give in to China for the following reasons, etc., etc. The reverse does not happen. And that basically enables the lack of transparency, enables China to make rules that do not give the open, transparent society the opportunity to have a level playing field. And then, of course, there are the more specific issues like coerced technology transfer, You insist that everybody has to have a joint venture, companies, especially with technology, and then you coerce them in one form or another to actually transfer that technology to you, thereby denying the American companies the advantage of innovation. And not only American companies, others. Cyber intrusion, which again is not playing by the rules. And there are many other factors of how China's companies, many of them are state-owned. Because they are state-owned, they have certain advantages that totally privately owned American companies can never have. So China's lack of transparency, number one basket of critiques. Second basket of critiques, China's reluctance to sort of play by the same or similar rules. So the fear that China does not play fair because of that. The third, I would argue, is that the end of the presentation had the term that we should not let strategic misjudgment. Now, I would have some contention with that term, because the Americans don't think our judgment on the strategic issues is misjudgment. It's China's characterization of it. The American side and America's allies would say that this is our judgment. And why is that judgment? I would say that that judgment also comes partly because of the lack of transparency in the argumentations and the presentations. And I think the Chinese side needs to make a greater effort at explaining some of its decisions and judgments and policies. Just to give you an example, one of our colleagues, Dr. Pandey, in the earlier session, talked about some of the moves in the Indian Ocean. Now, those moves are not purely economic by any stretch of the imagination. Maldives, an economy of only 4 billion. China's attention to the Maldives is disproportionate to the size of the economy, totally disproportionate to the size of the economy. Investment in its politics. And the only explanation, at least looking from here, seems to be that the Maldives can then offer a potential offset to Western bases in Diego Garcia. And therefore, it provides a platform for future Indo-Pacific military or naval rivalry. Now, if that is not the Chinese intent, and I'm prepared to concede the possibility that the world of intents is not something that you can actually sort of imagine without looking at what's happening. So you have to have an explanation for why you do that. Why do you want a port in Sri Lanka which is not economically sustainable? Hambantota, which the Chinese have had to take over. The port of Gwadar on the Makran coast in Pakistan, which is going to put Chinese vessels within very close reach of the Persian Gulf, the Arab Gulf countries. So some of the, if we're going to talk only in economic and trade terms, then economic and trade decisions usually are about certain dimensions of gain and profit. And if your ostensibly economic decisions cannot be sustained or justified purely on economic grounds, then that raises strategic questions. And those strategic questions need to be answered beyond being said, no, that's just your imagination. No, that's just your fear. They need to be addressed, they need to be discussed, and they need to be discussed much more openly. So I would say that, it's very interesting. This morning it was said that the Chinese are very flexible, and that's true. It was a very good enlightening sort of illustration that was given that, a person is a Confucianist when he's in government, a Taoist when he's out of government, and a Buddhist at the sunset of his life. But it also seems to many in America that China's flexibility exists mainly when it benefits China. The flexibility does not, and the term mutual benefit also often means that it's mutual benefit that will benefit one side more. That may be a wrong and erroneous impression. But if that is the impression, an effort needs to be made by us collectively to try and address that. Why is it there? What causes it? China sometimes is a developing country or presents itself as a developing country. Sometimes it is the engine of global economic growth, and sometimes it is a major global power. So that's a bit, Confucianist at one point, Taoist at one point, Buddhist at one point. So are you a developing country? Are you an emerging world power? Or are you a major contributor to global economic growth? Or are you all three of them at the same time? In which case, the Americans do have the right to say you cannot have all the advantages of being a developing country while at the same time getting ready to become our peer as a strategic competitor. And I think those are valid criticisms and questions that need to be addressed. I think I have more or less summarized and set the stage for Arthur to take the ball forward and maybe take it all the way across the finishing line.
Oh, across the finishing line. That's quite an ambitious goal. I have one quick question for you, though, Ambassador. Your School of Candor Diplomacy, how many students have you been able to enroll in that area? We're all very eager to find out.
It's a difficult one, but enrollment is open.
Oh, it is open. There we are. I can only encourage. More enrollees and more graduates in time. I'm Arthur Herman, Senior Fellow here, colleague of my friends Mike Pillsbury and Ambassador Haqqani. It's a pleasure to be here. A pleasure also to have you here as our guests and to be part of this ongoing discussion on this very important.
Author of 8 books, right? A minimum
Nine?
of 8, 9 books.
9?
Author of 9 books.
9 books and director of the Hudson's Quantum Alliance Institute. What I want to talk about is this issue from the angle that I know best, which is in the area of advanced technologies, and also from my perspective as an historian, which is what most of my books have been about. And from the historian's perspective, I would say that what we are experiencing right now in the area of U.S. China relations is part of a historical process that's been unfolding since, I would say, 1850. That from 1850 to 1950, that the history of Asia, in many cases, large part of global history was affected by the decline of China. And that what we've seen from 1950 into the present has been the disruptive effects of the rise of China, which has provided ways to displace and to disrupt the patterns of international behavior and norms, including in trade, which had been established and which the other nations of the world were comfortable with during that long stretch, and assumptions that were built during that long stretch in which the real key issue that everyone had to face was what to do about China's decline. Now the issue that the world faces is what to do about China's rise. What we've noticed, I think, in that process of China's rise as a great power has been a shift in emphasis in the last, I would say, decade or so, but that has really come into central focus with President Xi, and that is of China's desire to rise not merely as a global presence, but as a global dominant presence. And to really think of China now as coming into its own and succeeding the Pax Americana that had been established since World War II under the leadership and to a large extent under the military aegis of the United States, and that what is to emerge now will be a Pax Psionica, in which China will become sort of, let's say, the dominant presence with a similar broad beneficial effect on the rest of the world, but particularly a beneficial effect for China. Now, that's my perspective as an historian. From my perspective as a policy analyst, where I see this approach most clearly with regard to the pursuit of global dominance is in the area of advanced technologies, what we call high tech. And what I have been watching over the last 4 years as I analyze the trends that have been taking place in this area, but particularly in the area of artificial intelligence, quantum technology, supercomputers, microchips, advanced wireless technology, is that China has developed and should be, and I think it should be admired for, developing a grand strategy with regard to these technologies. And the United States is only belatedly waking up to the fact that China has a grand strategy, and the United States now needs to start thinking about a grand strategy of its own. Because what we find ourselves in now, thanks to China's aggressive pursuit of dominance in these areas, is we now find ourselves in what I termed in an article that ran last month in National Review, is a war, a conflict for high-tech supremacy, which in many ways parallels the race for high-tech, for naval supremacy between Great Britain and Germany on the eve of World War I, in which a challenging revisionist power tried to establish the kind of supremacy in that vital area to over a country, or to displace a country which had for more than a century enjoyed that naval dominance and maritime supremacy. Now, this is a conflict or a contest or a race for high-tech supremacy that we now find ourselves in with China and the United States, which I believe China can't win. But I think it is also a contest in which, as with the contest for naval supremacy between Great Britain and Germany, in which both countries could be losers. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, first of all, what we see from the point of view of where China is a pattern of enormous public investment as well as private investment in certain key areas of high technology. I go through the numbers in my article in National Review, so I won't spend a lot of time going over it with you, but I would just point to a couple of areas. One is artificial intelligence, in which President Xi and the CCP has announced that they will spend $150 billion in order to make China an artificial intelligence-driven society by 2030. In the area of quantum technology, we have right now a bill here in Congress, which has now been submitted to the Senate, which I had a little bit of role to help to shape.
You didn't lobby.
I didn't lobby, but I helped to sort of background information for it, and for the coalition of companies that were involved in it. A bill to spend $1.3 billion over the next 10 years to foster quantum technology. What we know is that China is spending $10 billion to develop a quantum research and technology center, which is going to have applications which China is not at all ashamed to admit will have important ones for the PLA and also for PLAN. We know that Alibaba has committed to spend also $10 billion in the areas of high tech, including quantum as well as artificial intelligence. Baidu has also committed similar funding to go into this area. Our funding for the House bill, $1.3 billion, is about in line with what companies like IBM and Intel and Microsoft are spending in this area. So these are two areas in which fundamentally China is outspending us about 10 to 1. 10 to 1 in these areas, both of which have enormous implications, not just from an economic standpoint, in terms of really sort of gearing societies into the advanced technology age, to the post-digital age, in the case of quantum, but also have enormous national security implications at the same time. The challenge that China is going to face are twofold, however, as they race down this line towards gaining foothold and global dominance in these technologies. The first is the United States is bound to respond. The United States, and it is beginning to respond. It's beginning to respond also in the trade area. And from my perspective, these issues that you've all been discussing so intelligently and correctly in the area of trade, to mine, is subsumed under larger geopolitical and grand strategic areas. And we saw this, for example, with regard to the suspension of sale of microchips to ZTE earlier this spring, which had a devastating effect on ZTE's supply chain. In fact, ZTE sort of said, we're going to have to close some parts of our business because we can't get those semiconductors. It's very interesting. Now that ban was lifted later on as part of the
After
to and fro.
President Xi called President Trump,
Right, that's right. As part of the to and fro with regard to what we characterize as a trade war. But it did, I think, to a certain degree, reveal both an unexpected element of Chinese vulnerability in this area, both in an economic but also in a strategic sense. But it also revealed the fact the United States is aware of what's going on. And although the spending has not accelerated to match, and I don't think it necessarily has to match what China is doing, the United States is beginning to realize that this is a race for high-tech supremacy that it does not want to lose. And it will do what it takes in order to make sure it doesn't lose its leadership in information technology and other high-tech areas. But there's also a second reason why I think China challenge that China faces, and that is that a lot of the push that China has gotten underway in this area is done through the government and involves state-owned enterprises and enterprises which have become fully integrated in terms of its goals and aims with those of the CCP and the Chinese government. As one Chinese IT executive said recently, our interests are fused together. Now you can get a lot of synergy that way in high-tech areas by having the goals of government and the goals of industry fused together. There can be a lot that can be accomplished that way. But there's also a lot that can get in the way of development of advanced technologies when innovation and entrepreneurship is, should we say, restricted or limited by large-scale public enterprises and goals that are set by government officials as opposed to by company executives and by engineers and scientists and others who are really driving force behind high-tech change and behind high-tech industries here. Now, I'm not predicting that out of this fusion will come what should I call it? I'll call it a Lysenko moment, when the government begins to sort of dictate, this is the direction you're going to go, and these are also the scientific and engineering principles that you're going to follow in ways that Chinese companies like Baidu or like Huawei or ZTE will have no choice but to participate, even though perhaps their scientists and engineers will tell them behind closed doors, this isn't going to work. This is a dead end. The Americans are actually, or the Europeans are actually moving in directions that are more beneficial. Is there some way we can work with them? And it turns out, because of the grand strategic goals that are involved here, that it's not possible to achieve that. And that's the third element I think Chinese are going to face. We're talking about everything in threes today, aren't we? And that is that the degree to which China's push for global dominance in these high-tech areas will begin more and more to close the possibilities for international cooperation and collaboration. That it'll become more challenging for those countries who, like the United States is an example, but it's not the only one, who began to realize that cooperation with China in these areas is more and more of a win-lose proposition. Win for China, lose for China's collaborators. This is not a happy situation. And I think that if we were going to reverse this process, and my final remarks on this, if we're going to wind down this contest or race for high-tech supremacy. Or marathon. I think what we need to do is to perhaps make China's leadership realize that the liberal international order, which has governed trade and economic relations around the globe since World War II, which the United States was instrumental in building and supporting, is an international order that was not constructed in order to thwart China's destiny. It was not one that was built in order to advance U.S. national interests at the expense of others. But it was, in fact, an liberal international order which China has enormously benefited from. That China's rise as a global economy would have been impossible without that order, which it now seeks to challenge or, in many cases, displace. And in fact, if you read my colleague Mike Pillsbury's book, The 100-Year Marathon, one of the important themes of that book is precisely the degree to which the United States worked tirelessly to encourage economic growth for China. to make China into an economic player on the global stage, and that the degree to which it, I'm going to use the expression, feather-bedded the relationship with China in order to encourage China's economic growth, to make it rise and make it part of that international order. And this explains, I think, to a degree why we get the reaction now from the Trump administration, from Peter Navarro and others, and so on, is the feeling that we've done a lot for China and China doesn't seem to respond to that in terms of reciprocal relationships. That the discrepancies and the asymmetries that Ambassador Haqqani pointed out limits America's ability to continue down this path. And it's time for us to gain back some of the advantages that we willingly gave away in those years, starting in the late 80s. And it's now time to rethink that relationship. I don't think that's, by the way, I think in the short term, it's an understandable and perhaps justifiable. In the long term, however, the future lies with U.S. China cooperation. But it has to be on a very different basis than where we are now. And the area of high-tech systems and of advanced technologies is where I think we need to make some serious breakthroughs if this isn't going to be not a win-lose proposition and not a win-win proposition, but a lose-lose proposition.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Professor,
Going to depart, and I sit next to Professor Tong. Ambassador Haqqani asked earlier if he could depart as part of the Candor Diplomacy School for a previous engagement.
Okay.
All right, so,
Professor Tong, you are the final speaker today.
all right, so thank you very much for having me here. First time to Hudson, beautiful office space. And also thank you, Dr. Wang, for creating this opportunity to have these rational and mutually respectful dialogues between the Hudson experts and also experts from China. So I'm sort of in between. I've been teaching at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies for the last 5 years. I travel to China a lot. I was born and raised in Hong Kong. I got my postgraduate educations at MIT, so I have realized that I'm sort of stuck in between when I think about the U.S. China relations and trade war in particular. But let me do something that is more neutral, and that is my expertise. I'm an economist. I was a trained economist, and also realized that I'm the only economist among the 10 people on the panels. So I'm going to do something that I'm relatively better at, which I would teach my students as comparative advantage. So my comparative advantage is to talk about facts, look at some numbers, and tell you about sort of the current situation about global trade, rather than just trade between China and the US specifically. Teaching aside, for the last 5 years, I have interacted with a lot of people who talked about grand strategies, dependency theory, and many other interesting topics in IR. So I have some opinion about that, but I would like to share those later during the Q&A. And for now, just bear with me. I'm going to spend 5 minutes talking about facts. All right? So we live in a world of global value chains, which economists will call GVC. Okay? Trade is very different from what David Ricardo would describe about trade 200 years ago, right? So in his classic book, he would say, this is wine for cloth, right? The British is best at producing cloth, while the Portuguese are best at producing wine, so they trade and they benefit from trade. Today, we don't see that much of final goods trade anymore. Trade is largely about trade of intermediate inputs, all right? Just to give you some numbers, 2/3 of global trade is trade of intermediate inputs, all right? Automobile parts, electronic components, stuff that you will find inside an iPhone rather than an iPhone itself. Talking about the US, 1/3 of import from the rest of the world, not only from China, from the rest of the world, is within the firm boundary of multinational firms, right? So many of which are imports by Apple, by other multinationals with headquarters in the US, all right? So those are facts that we should keep in mind when we talk about the US-China trade war. So based on this new phenomenon of global trade, I think there are at least 4 implications. So I'm going to violate the rule of talking about 3. So there are 4 implications about how GVC will affect our interpretations of the current situation. So the first one, which has been highlighted and emphasized by the Trump administration a lot, is the US has been running a huge bilateral trade deficit against China. So I don't think that claim is correct, but let me tell you why, as a trade economist, why I think that statement is just incorrect. So first of all, if you just use gross trade flows as the basis to compute bilateral trade deficits or surpluses, the numbers are going to be biased in the following way. And I'm going to give you an example, and you will see why the current way of measuring trade surplus or biases, trade surplus or deficits, are incorrect. Many of you are using iPhones. When the US Customs try to record an import item from China to the US, the iPhone will come as a product that is worth $500 trade deficit, right? So between US and China. But within an iPhone, you realize that a lot of components and parts are actually coming from US allies in the region, in particular Japan and Korea. So that $500 value is already biased upward in the sense that there has been a lot of double counting in the value of trade from China to the US, right? So there is a wonderful research done by Rob Johnson, who used to be at Dartmouth, also an economic professor, who estimated that the bilateral deficit between US and China has been inflated by about 40%, 40, right? So if you have the correct way to measure trade flows using the term value added, then the value added trade deficit between US and China is still pretty big, but is 40% less than what has been reported by the US government or on the news. So related to this point, I also want to emphasize that even you take away the 40%, the trade deficit that has been on the news has been overestimated because, first of all, surface trade has been totally ignored in the measures of bilateral trade, right? So US has a comparative advantage in surface exports. Many Chinese students come to the US to get their education. That is surface export from US to China. But surprisingly, there's no way to record those kind of surface exports from the US to China in the current trade accounts. And the final point about trade deficits is US firms has been establishing a lot of affiliates inside China and selling to the Chinese customers. Because those transactions did not cross the US-China trade border, those numbers do not also get recorded in the US-China trade deficit, all right? So that's my first point about why we should think hard about global value chains and the implications on one of the most important policy debate, which is about trade deficit between China and the US. The second implication is related to the effectiveness of US tariffs on China, all right? So it is very natural to think about or justify why the US government has put tariffs on the so-called high-tech or strategic products. Many of them are being mentioned by the Chinese government in the Made in China 2025. But if you look at those products, those exports from China had a huge US content, partly because the US firms have been investing a lot in those supply chains, which happen at the final stage being produced in China. It also because many of them actually had foreign components from other advanced economies, once again, Japan and Korea. So if the Trump administration is going to put tariffs on those sort of high-tech R&D intensive products, it is going to be very ineffective in affecting the Chinese economy. And there will be a huge pass-through to the US allies in the region, including Japan and Korea. So let me talk about my third point, which is the effect of Chinese import on the US labor market, right? So in my trade class, I will talk about the benefits from trade, but I will also talk about the winners and losers in globalization. So don't get me wrong, I think a lot of people lost their jobs during the last 2 decades, partly due to globalization, but also partly due to technological change. But to blame China or Chinese trade on the US labor market, I think is a bit exaggerated, all right? So there's a famous paper with a very provocative title called The Chinese Syndrome inspired by the famous movie China Syndrome in the 1970s. And the authors of the papers are famous economists from MIT and UC San Diego, would argue that the so-called China shock led to substantial manufacturing job losses in the US. And what they didn't consider is first, global value chains, and second, exports from the US to China. Subsequent studies done by also very distinguished trade economists, one of them being Rob Finstra at UC Davis, take a first step to basically incorporate export from US to China and realize that the net effect of US-China trade on the US labor market is basically zero. There's no gain, low losses in terms of US jobs. And there's another study done by another distinguished trade economist called Shenjin Wei at Columbia Business School. And he finds that once you incorporate I/O linkages, input-output linkages, there's actually a small net positive effect on the US labor market. All right? So I'm just telling you the facts. I don't know which one I should take, but I think the China Syndrome paper only capture part of the story. All right. So I made 3 points. I think I have a fourth one, which is about my own research, yes. So how should we think about the economic losses of the US-China trade war? We don't have the estimates or the required statistics to quantify the actual impacts yet, because we still have to wait for the US Commerce and also the Chinese customs to offer the data about trade and many other macroeconomic variables. But I have done my own research using something that you can download online right away, which is the financial market performance of publicly listed firms in the US and also in China. So let me briefly tell you the results of that new research. So we look at the surprise on March 22nd, when Trump announced sort of the first trade war type instruments on 50 billion Chinese imports into the US, right? So from today's perspective, it's a small number, but at that time, the numbers surprised many investors. Between March 21st and March 23rd, Dow Jones and NASDAQ declined by about 4.5%, all right? So you can argue, well, this is not the right number to think about the effect on the US economy because, investors tend to overreact and, financial market didn't really capture the real economy. But that is the best we can do, right? Because those are the only data that we can look at to think about the expected impact on the US economy. So what we did further is to look at firms that are exposed to US-China trade in terms of importing stuff from China or exporting final goods or services to China. Firms that are more exposed tend to experience a more negative decline in the financial market outcomes measured by stock price, bond returns, and also default risk. And more important than this, firms that are indirectly exposed to US-China trade, meaning they don't trade directly with China, but their suppliers buy stuff from China or the customers rely on businesses in China, that indirect effect is even larger than the direct effect. And this is also true for China, right? So this is a lose-lose situation which can be captured by focusing on looking at the impact on each country's financial market. If you're interested, I'm happy to share the paper with you and give you more specifics. But let me conclude by saying that the US-China trade war has created a lose-lose situation already, in addition to a lot of uncertainty that investors didn't like. Again, I speak as an economist. I have some other ideas about why this may or may not be right. But I think isolating China and potentially create a possibility for a new Cold War is not going to be constructive for the US-China relations in the long run, but also for the global stability in the long run. Henry Kissinger, who is a good friend of Tsai's, has proposed to engage China in the 1970s. Recently has been quite quiet about the US-China relations, but I wonder what he would think. But if he thought 1970s was the right time to engage China, I'm not sure why this is the right time to isolate China. Thank you.
Okay, Henry, you want to take some more questions?
Yeah, we can do that. Yes, sure.
I have one for Professor Tong. just like Professor Jia, you ignored the report. It's a topic, a topic today. And I checked the 9 people who wrote the report. You're not one of them. And they don't, the report does not cite your research.
Because it was too new.
So
when they wrote the report, maybe my paper was not finished yet.
So would you want to tell us if you agree with anything in this report or nothing, or
I agree with most of it.
most of it? So you've read it.
I read it. Well, I read
You're not
very quickly.
deliberately snubbing this report today.
So I didn't read all the footnotes like you did, but I read very quickly about the main content. And let me say one thing which is consistent with the big picture of the report. China did benefit a lot by getting into the WTO, all right? Whether they win double of what US won or whatever is another question, and I'm happy to talk about that. But one thing that China benefited from accessing to the WTO is WTO created external pressure for the Chinese government to push through privatization around 2000. So China has been sort of taking advantage of joining international organizations to induce domestic reforms, which is good for the Chinese economy, but also for the rest of the world. So I think, by dueling or responding to the U.S. China trade war, there could be another possibility for the Chinese government to impose some of the domestic reforms that have been delayed and tackle some of the political constraints that did not allow them to be faster in pushing those reforms.
I teach a course of graduate students on a Chinese strategy. I just wanted to invite you to be guest lecturer in this class, because I don't think they've heard this point of view before.
So which school do you teach?
Institute of World Politics.
Okay, I'm happy to do it. Yeah.
Thank you.
As long as it's not Georgetown, which is our competitor.
Okay, Henry, you want to call on the questions?
Yeah, we could probably have a few minutes. If we have any questions that, sure, yes.
Wait for the mic, please. Thank you. To the most recent speaker, how do you explain that the stock market, the Dow Jones average, has reached record highs in the last week if the trade war has been adversely affecting businesses in the United States, like you say?
Yeah, so just by looking at the market performance, there are many factors that can affect stock market index. Whether there's a bubble or not, I don't even know. But what we looked at is when the announcement was made, what happened to the stock market. And by now, I think most of the publicly listed firms in the US already digested the news. There's already a U.S. China trade war. So further announcements about tariffs on China is not going to affect the expectations anymore. The reason why we focus on March 22nd is because there was the first major announcement about putting tariffs on China. And that was a surprise. And financial economists love surprises in their studies. And now there's no longer surprise that there will be another wave of tariffs. So at least the firms are not responding. There may be other factors that drive the stock market performance. As what Trump has said, maybe the strong U.S. Job market has encouraged some of the investors to go back to the stock market again.
After the final question is asked, I'm going to ask our CEO, President of Hudson, to say the final words. Any more questions? There seem to be a lot of questions over here on this side. For you, I think, Professor Tong. There's maybe for Arthur.
Thank you very much. Actually, I'm from your competitor at Georgetown. I'm from Georgetown University.
no.
But I'm curious on the issue of intellectual property because you didn't mention much of it, and I wanted to get your views on it. And also, I was actually quite surprised in the CCG report on intellectual property, where there was so little, let's say, complaint about it, and so little seemed concerned about it from American companies. And I'm wondering if it's like having to do with surveys here in the U.S. Sometimes people answer or they don't answer, but they don't necessarily answer truthfully. In other words, if I'm an American company in China, and my situation is one that I could be very badly hurt if I say, yeah, I really do have complaints about intellectual property, but I'm going to remain mum about it because I just don't want to hurt, the situation that I have. So it strikes me that maybe the numbers that you have are low. How low, I actually don't know, but they could be affected by coercion, from the top, saying, no, I don't want you to be telling the truth on this. I want you to say that everything is really perfectly good, relative to the intellectual property. So I'd like to kind of tease out from both of you or from anybody else on this intellectual property issue, because your results were quite surprising to me.
Okay, maybe I could add on that. And I think for the business community, there's about 68,000 U.S. company set up in China operating. It's really a market decision, economic decision for them to enter China. Whether it's in JV format, which is WTO allowed it to give China that kind of arrangement in the past. And then, if those business companies not making money there, why on earth they're still there? Why are they making this kind of company? So furthermore, the survey was conducted year by year, and it's a random survey without your names revealed. So it's a secret ballot. So they don't have to hide for the U.S. chambers of their entity. So I think that's really reflect the situation. So I think that the U.S. company has willingly or benefited. If they can sell their technology, they can use the JV to exchange for market occupation. Nobody forced them to be there or to do the transfer. Like Chinese leaders have said many times, that can you tell me who did that? I'm going to punish them. Well, there's nobody said that. As I said in my report, 80% of the foreign company complained they got their case win if they take that rule. So I think there's over exaggeration of forced technology transfer. I don't that is where it's coming from. If you talk about JV, which there is a JV requirement from the WTO days, this could be discussed again through BIT, which is already touching those issues through the potential trade talks that we can talk about this. But even for JV, it was on a willing basis. If somebody wants to do that, they can always refuse to do, or if they want to do. There might be one case or two cases of companies which they use the name of a government, but it's not the Chinese government intention to deliberately do that. So I think there's a lot of explanation needs to be made. And so that's my. But finally, I would like to say just a few words, just to maybe conclude on my thought on that. Is we're getting into globalization now for the last 7 decades. I think the U.S. has been really leading that, setting up the United Nations, WTO, World Bank, IMF. China actually joined all those organizations. It's really an add-on support. China doesn't want to disrupt the current system and do anything very different. I think China is really for the last 4 decades. This year is the 40 years of diplomatic ties with the U.S. It's also not coincidentally. It's also 40 years of Chinese opening up. It's largely opening to the U.S. actually. So actually, U.S. company has benefited so much. So has China. And also this kind of trading relationship have helped China lift 800 million people out of poverty. That's an enormous contribution to the world. We don't want to see China become a North Korea or become Iran, which is posing threat to the world. China is really doing its own work. Of course, Chinese have its own 5,000 years history. They have its own system. There's always a uniqueness of Chinese culture. So as long as this system is working, why are we trying to greatly change that? I think there's a lot of things that maybe there's a misunderstanding. There's a lot of enough communication. There's not enough think tank talks. Of course, China made mistakes too in the past, and so has the U.S. But I don't think that after 7 decades of the peace, power, prosperity, we want to make the number 1 economy and number 2 economy fighting a trade war. These days we cannot afford to fight military war, but even fighting trade war is really dangerous and it's devastating. So Trump is a businessman. I mean, he's a great businessman. He knows how business is good. So if he wants to make America great again, China is a great partner. For example, President Trump wants to spend $1 trillion on the infrastructure. In the last decade, in the last 10 years, China spent $11 trillion. China's developed the fastest, most advanced infrastructure in the world, and that kind of expertise and capital can be helping the U.S. So I don't see the reason why the two countries really gets ugly on those issues, but really turn into advantage. I think maybe it's a wake-up call this time now with the trade war, and it's great that those countries look at the positions and make an adjustment and trying to get forward for both countries' benefit and for the world. So I think that all the talks this morning is really great. We appreciate the Hudson hosting this dialogue, and also we have the advisor from Trump administration to join us. But I think he also just mentioned about China was maybe the trade war unwillingly or hurted the U.S. soybean or Midwest. But U.S. sanctions also aimed at the China 2025 for the future technology advancement. So there's a bit of a tit for tat everything there. But I don't think it's really China doesn't want to fight the trade war. I mean, China said again, they're just forced to have to do something. But I think U.S. as the number one economy, as a leader of the free world, and also the world international governance system established should really has the responsibility, even though to get along all the countries together and then make the world great again. I think.
Okay, but you understand my position. I'm very disappointed. The CCG report and the Chinese government are denying and not dealing with President Trump's reports and concerns. This is dangerous. It's insulting to the White House, and we're going down the wrong path. So if this is all not an issue, you're talking about adding fuel to the fire.
No, I don't think.
U.S.-China new Cold War.
Yeah.
So
nobody wants to see that.
Be careful.
Yeah.
The Americans put out a lot of material.
Yeah. No.
What's wrong?
That's the
including on intellectual property.
It's deception, lying, cheating. These are very serious criminal charges.
I disagree on that. But 40,000.
Now he says President Xi Jinping is his friend, and the two of them are going to work this out.
Sure. Yeah.
So I think what your report is doing is suggesting here's some of the terms that could be discussed.
That's right.
But please don't deny the whole problem.
No, I'm not denying. What I'm saying is from my perspective, and also.
Otherwise, you get nothing of coming to Hudson today.
Yeah.
We're trying to educate you.
I think it's a dialogue.
I think the report did admit that there are room for improvement in the Chinese institutions. So it's not like there's.
I think we have.
China's already a perfect economy.
President Weinstein, please save us.
Yeah.
From
to conclude.
A win from a lose-lose situation.
No, yeah, exactly. Look, I want to thank the delegation from CCG. I want to thank Dr. Wang. I want to thank our Hudson colleagues, particularly the the director of our Center for Chinese Strategy, Mike Pillsbury, Arthur Herman, our other Hudson colleagues. This has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I was remarking outside the meeting room for a few moments, chatting with a journalist who said, these kind of people never appear together on panels. And I think that we have achieved that. There is a long way to go, however, in trying to resolve this dispute. And I agree fully with what Mike has said about the need for China really to come to grips with concerns of the Trump administration in order to make progress. And I look forward to reviewing the study, and I look forward to Hudson coming back with a response to the 14 points of the CCG study and to continuing the dialogue going forward. This has been a very useful exercise, a very useful first step, but further steps need to be made. And I want to again thank everyone for being here, for taking part, and for an enlightening discussion.
Thank you.